So the Las Vegas Raiders made one change with Tyree Wilson this past week against the Kansas City Chiefs, and it led to this guy actually having a lot more success. We're going to talk about that, plus Antonio Pierce was asked a little bit about Luke Getsy and his play calling, and I don't agree with it, but I want to talk about what he had to say about him. Let's get right into this video, man. I want to start right away talking a little bit about Tyree Wilson. You guys know that I was not a fan of drafting Tyree Wilson, especially with guys like Jalen Carter and Darnell Wright on the board at the time the Raiders made the pick. But the Raiders ended up going with Tyree Wilson. He was a guy that was more so of a project. He was a guy that had to develop. And usually that takes about 2 to 3 years. And we're in year 2 now. And we're starting to see some flashes by Tyree Wilson. In fact, he had his first sack of his second season against the Kansas City Chiefs. And this was a true winning sack. This wasn't a cleanup sack. This wasn't one of those sacks where it's high effort. This was a true winning snap where he took on Wanya Morris of the Kansas City Chiefs. He ended up beating the left tackle, and he got home. And it was a play that I think was arguably the best play this guy has made in terms of pass rush. But I will say this with Tyree Wilson, we saw a lot of really nice plays against the Kansas City Chiefs. In fact, I would honestly make the argument I think this was the best game Tyree Wilson has had over the course of his career. You know, most of the games when I watch Tyree Wilson, he doesn't do much. Right, you watch him, he locks in with the guy. He's not really doing anything that's impacting a play. But against the Kansas City Chiefs, he made multiple plays where he was actually impacting plays. And we'll talk about some of those plays at an individualized level here in a second. But the big change that the Raiders ultimately made with Tyree Wilson was for the first time he played mostly on the inside. He took about 70% of his snaps from the defensive tackle position. He mostly played the 3 technique, right? Keep in mind, if you're a D tackle, you can play as a nose. You can also play in the 1 tech or the 2-eye technique. He mostly played in the 3 technique. He took some snaps in the 4-eye and 5 technique as well. But generally speaking, this guy was playing most of his snaps as what you would see as, like a defensive tackle. A guy like Leonard Williams, a guy like Quinnen Williams. These guys are oftentimes playing the 3 technique, 4-eye, or 5 technique. And with Tyree Wilson, we kind of saw him play those similar type of role that those guys would play. And I feel like with Tyree Wilson, the thing is he's 6'6", 285 pounds. I almost feel like that's arguably his best fit. Now, I don't think Tyree Wilson shouldn't play on the edge. Truth be told, I think he had a lot better of a game against the Chiefs than he's had in the past. But we saw a lot of plays as well where Tyree Wilson was making from the inside. And I think the Raiders got to really consider keeping this guy on the inside full time. And maybe they will as we kind of go forward. Clayvon Chasen has kind of broken out for the Raiders a little bit. And although most of us expected Tyree Wilson to replace Malcolm Koonce as he kind of got hurt, Clayvon Chasen has looked really, really good as well, which means Tyree Wilson could naturally just jump to the inside. And I don't think that would be a bad fit for the Raiders. Now, Tyree can play inside. You can also put him back onto the outside. It's not that he has to only play one position, but we're starting to see flashes with this guy. And I want to talk about some of these snaps a little bit. So Tyree Wilson went up against arguably one of the best guards in the NFL in Trey Smith, and arguably another one of the best guards in the NFL in Joe Thuney. And Tyree Wilson had so many good reps against both of these guys. But there were snaps against Trey Smith specifically that stood out to me. Tyree Wilson got right into Trey Smith multiple times. He pushed him back. He reset the line of scrimmage against some of these outside zone run plays. In fact, on this play here, Tyree not only pushes this guy back, but he forces the running back to have to bend this back towards the inside. Now, Tyree doesn't actually make the play, but if you guys talk to coaches, you would understand why this play matters. When you're running these zone plays, easily the best way to score on these zone plays is just to run it right to the outside because you're going to have the least amount of guys towards that side. But the way to stop a zone play is to reset the line of scrimmage. If a zone run's going to go to the outside and Tyree Wilson doesn't allow the reach block, instead he resets the line of scrimmage, he penetrates the gap, he gets upfield. The running back now has to cut this underneath and essentially back to the inside where most of the defensive players generally are. And what that means is if you have good pursuit on zone runs, you're going to be able to make these plays. To me, Tyree Wilson did this multiple times where he was able to control Trey Smith, where he was able to push him back. And you even saw that in pass pro, right, where he pushed this guy back. And it almost looked like these guys kind of struggled to block Tyree Wilson or to push Tyree Wilson. I feel like this guy was doing a really good job holding his own. Joe Thuney struggled as well to move Tyree. And, you're really starting to see that 6'6" frame, that 285-pound plus frame. We're seeing that kind of come together. And I feel like, when you're putting Tyree Wilson against guys that may be a little bit smaller, maybe it's guys that are like 6'2", 6'3", so they're not as long as Tyree Wilson. I almost feel like it's a mismatch for those guys to go up against a guy like Tyree, right? Because he's taller, he's longer, he's lengthier, he can outreach guys. And I think that could be one of those things for the Raiders, depending on matchup, can ultimately take advantage of those things. Even Wanya Morris is like 6'4", 6'4.5". He's the left tackle that is currently starting for the Kansas City Chiefs, and Tyree Wilson ended up beating him as well. And there were multiple snaps even against Morris where Tyree Wilson got close to the quarterback, or he got his hands on the quarterback, or he was getting close. Now, of course, Tyree Wilson is not a finished product, and he isn't fully developed, right? He has to continue to get better. But as Antonio Pierce told us in his presser earlier, the one thing Tyree Wilson has to continue to do is he has to continue to get snaps. And if he gets those snaps, if he's able to develop, he'll get better and better and better as we kind of go forward. And you're seeing that on tape. Like, this guy's taken over 200 snaps so far this season, and he's looked better and better and better as it kind of went on, right? Tyree Wilson has looked a lot better over the course of the season, and he even missed the first 2 weeks, right? And then in the third week, although he played, you could tell he wasn't really like the full-time guy for the Raiders in that game. But the guy's definitely gotten better and better, and you can definitely see that on tape. And I'm excited to see what Tyree Wilson actually ends up developing into. But I think the Raiders got to continue to utilize this guy in specific matchups. You're going to go up against the Cincinnati Bengals. One of the things the Bengals have on their offensive line is their tackles specifically are guys that are monster tackles. They have Orlando Brown Jr., they have Trent Brown. Those are like 350-pound tackles. They have Amarius Mims, who's like another guy that's like 350 pounds. That might not be the best matchup for Tyree Wilson, right? You might want to put a guy like Clavon Chasen on those guys because Chasen's a lot faster. Those tackles are a lot slower. But the Bengals don't have great interior guys, and that could be a mismatch for Tyree Wilson. You might want to put him on the inside where he can out-leverage guys, right? He can outreach these guys. He might have a longer wingspan. So to me, I think the Raiders got to just continue to utilize these guys, this guy against guys that might be a little bit smaller, and just try to have this guy just continue to develop. And I don't think we should move him full-time to the 3 technique full-time as a defensive tackle. I think we should just continue to move this guy around and continue to let him play in the various positions. And I think that's going to be the best thing forward with Tyree Wilson. And I think there's a chance this guy actually develops into a good football player. What I've seen over this season so far, over the last 3 weeks, it's given me hope that this guy in year 3, right, he'll go into this offseason, he'll develop, he'll come back next year. In year 3, it gives me hope that Tyree Wilson can actually be a good, productive football player. And hopefully the Raiders are able to keep this guy long-term and he becomes a guy that can actually be a good player opposite of Maxx Crosby. I also want to take a moment here to talk a little bit about what Antonio Pierce actually had to say when it came to the play calling, what he had to say about Luke Getsy a little bit. One of the interesting things that I think most of us understand with the Raiders right now is our play caller is holding us back more than anything. There's nothing holding this team back more. It's not the defensive line. It's not the offensive line. It's not the defensive coach. It's not the safeties coach. It's not any of these players, not even the quarterback position that's holding the Raiders back at this point. And I think we can see that when a guy like Aiden O'Connell came in and he had his struggles. When Gardner Minshew's come in, he's had multiple turnovers. I think we can see at this point that the Raiders' biggest struggles right now is the fact that our play calling is just not that good. And Antonio Pierce was asked a little bit about that play calling. And AP said that he thinks that play calling does have to get better because there's been a lot of opportunities. And of course, that's on the play calling. But AP told his players and the staff that all of those things, penalties, missed assignments, have to also get cleaned up. And he said that Luke Getsy is essentially going to end up staying as the Raiders play caller. Now, I don't think the Raiders should do anything different in terms of Luke Getsy at this point. But I would even make the argument that the Bengals game could be the last time I would allow Luke Getsy to call plays. And here's the thing, you don't have to fire Luke Getsy. All right, if Luke Getsy struggles, you don't have to fire this guy, right? Up to this point, we've seen this guy struggling. But the thing is, you got to realize that, Luke Getsy as a play caller is one thing, but then there's the whole element of spacing. There's the whole element of calling plays that don't make sense. Running zone runs, for example, in goal line situation does not make sense. And Luke Getsy did that. He called 3 straight zone runs in the goal line situation. I think we're at the 3-yard line, and we ended up getting stopped, and we went for it on 4th down, and we still ended up getting stopped once again. Those things are on Luke Getsy. And here's the thing: if Luke Getsy continues to show us, which he's already shown us for 6-7 games at this point, if he continues to show us that he's not a good play caller, if he doesn't know what he's doing, the Raiders got to make a change. You don't even have to fire Luke Getsy. All you have to do is take the Las Vegas Raiders take the Las Vegas Raiders pass game coordinator, that is Scott Turner, and give him the play calling duties. Right? Scott Turner has had, he's been a play caller in the past. He's had success, right? He was with Sam Howell over the last 2 years. Sam Howell showed a little bit of upside. Scott Turner, to me, is a guy that I would absolutely say, hey, Luke Getsy's not working. He showed us against the Bengals. You have this entire bye week to, ultimately get ready for the week after. I would make that change and see if Scott Turner could even potentially take over and do a better job. Because here's the thing. If Scott Turner is even a little bit better than Luke Getsy, we'll be able to actually win some games. And I'm not saying we should win games and kill our potential draft pick. Right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about AP, right? We got to figure out if Antonio Pierce is the Raiders coach or not. Because there's been moments where Antonio Pierce has mismanaged the game. There's been moments where we've questioned what this guy's done. But we also got to recognize that the play calling is very, very frustrating. And if we have good play calling, can Antonio Pierce actually be a good coach? Right? And the Raiders got to figure that out right there. Right? Could the Raiders actually be good if the Raiders have good play calling? Because the worst thing that could happen is the Raiders next year end up finding, a top 5 play caller. Maybe, they go out and, it's Clint Kubiak or Clay Kubiak, who's Clint Kubiak's brother, currently with the 49ers. Even if the Raiders hire one of these guys, if AP's not a good coach, it doesn't matter who your play caller is because he'll be fired by week 5 of next season if the Raiders start 0-5 or whatever, if we're not a good football team. All right, so the Raiders got to find out with AP as well, and I think one of the ways to find that out is by potentially making the switch at offensive coordinator. Right, make that switch from Luke Getsy not calling plays anymore. And again, you don't have to fire him. Right, he'll still be with the team. He'll still be the guy that's kind of helping out. He'll make sure Scott Turner and all the guys on the offense side are good to go. But I don't think Antonio Pierce can continue to ignore the fact that Luke Getsy has been a bad coach up to this point. And I understand the penalties aspect of it because Jackson Powers-Johnson had 2 false starts this past game. But those 2 false starts ended up not really mattering because we still ended up getting down to the 4-yard line on that drive where Powers-Johnson had ultimately back-to-back false starts. And we weren't able to punch it in from the 4-yard line. And then on the next drive, we got the ball at the 3-yard line, and we weren't able to punch it in on that drive either, right? So at the end of the day, we got to figure out what's really the issue as we kind of go forward. And then talking about some of the updates we've gotten out of practice, a player specifically that ended up getting hurt this past week was Andre James, the Las Vegas Raiders center, long-term center, I should say at this point. He did not practice today, and I think for the Raiders, this is actually a good thing, and this can potentially be one of those things that allows the Raiders to actually get better with the guy potentially missing some time. Last week, what we saw from Jackson Powers-Johnson was very promising. In fact, I would make the argument Powers-Johnson's tape screams top 5 center to me, but I need to see him do it one more time. And the Cincinnati Bengals have a pretty good defensive line. I think this is a great team to really see if Powers-Johnson's a good center or not. And what's interesting that Antonio Pierce actually told us today is Jackson Powers-Johnson took 0 center snaps during all of OTAs. And this is something that I had talked about in the past. So Powers-Johnson came to the Raiders in rookie minicamp as well as OTAs. He took a little bit of snaps at the center position. He played both left guard and right guard, but in training camp, he took no snap outside of mostly at left guard. I think he might have taken some at right guard, but it was mostly at left guard. What's interesting about Powers-Johnson and the snaps that he ultimately ended up taking is the fact that he's never played center in the NFL. And he came in and he did his thing. He came in, he was able to identify the mic, he was able to communicate with the offensive lineman on every single play. The slide calls, everything was really, really, really flawless. And there was only 14 snaps minus the spiked plays, right? I think there was like 2 spikes. But the 14 snaps he actually played in, right? He looked very, very, very good. And I think for the Raiders, you almost want to keep Andre James out to see if Jackson Powers-Johnson might actually be able to give you a spark. I'll be the first to tell you guys, I think rolling forward with Dylan Parham, Jordan Meredith, and Jackson Powers-Johnson give you the best interior offensive line that you'll have this season. And then keeping DJ Glaze and Colt Miller at the tackle positions obviously are going to be the 2 best options at this point. And I think for the Raiders, you actually have a decent offensive line with those 5 guys out there. Meredith's a very, very smart football player, right? Him and Powers-Johnson will be able to communicate. They'll be able to switch on defensive line games, which we actually saw this past week. These guys were able to swap guys, and they're able to just be on the same page. We'll also see that Dylan Parham practice today, so we'll also be able to kind of see how he fits in with that as well. Meredith will probably jump over to left guard, and then, of course, at right guard, we'll probably get Dylan Parham to just kind of take his position back. keep in mind, Dylan Parham was our backup center, right? So because he was out this past week, Jackson Powers-Johnson took those snaps. But this upcoming week, Dylan Parham is expected back, while Andre James is still 50-50. But I would love for the Raiders to just roll forward with Jackson Powers-Johnson. Even if Andre could potentially play, I would argue that the Raiders should hold him out, because I think there's a real chance Jackson Powers-Johnson has top 5 potential at the center position. And I think it just makes the most sense to see what this guy has. You know, this season doesn't do anything for the Raiders other than get us a high draft pick. At least let's find out if we have a top 5 caliber center. Let's find out if we need to go out and get guards, right? This draft's very, very deep at the guard position. I want to find out if the Raiders need to draft a guard in this class, because the last thing I want the Raiders to do is say, hey, Jackson Powers-Johnson, our guard for next season, and Andre James is our center, only to realize that James still sucks next year, and then to have to move Jackson Powers-Johnson to center, and then you never drafted a guard because you just thought Powers-Johnson was going to be the guy. To me, the Raiders got to figure this out, and I think these next 7, 8, 9 weeks is a great time to figure those things out, right? Because we can go into this offseason in a very, very deep guard class, get a guy in the 2nd or 3rd round, and get a guy that, with Powers-Johnson, that guy, and then whoever it is, maybe it's Dylan Parham at guard, maybe DJ Glaze, depending on what the Raiders end up doing at the tackle position. The Raiders could have a very, very, very legit offensive line, and we can actually build a bully. And I think that's what the Raiders got to try to trend towards, right? Get out there, build a bully. I was watching the Pittsburgh Steelers offensive line earlier today, and I'm going to wrap it up with this story. And I did not recognize how much of a bully these guys are building up front. And it's not 100% there right now, right? It's really not. But the Pittsburgh Steelers last year drafted this 6'8", 265-pound tackle in Darnell Washington. Most people know who that is. He played at Georgia. Monster, right? Every time you watch this guy out there lined up at tight end, you think it's an extra offensive lineman. He's monstrous, right? I saw snaps of this guy going up against Maxx Crosby and being able to hold his own against Maxx in pass pro. And I bring that up because it's not just Darnell Washington, right? They got guys like Isaac Samalo. Zach Frazier is one of the best centers in the NFL already. In my opinion, he's just a rookie. They got guys like Broderick Jones, who's massive and strong. And these guys are trying to run people over, right? The Raiders say they want to run people over, right? That's what Antonio Pierce always says, right? He says we want to be physical. We want to impose our will. The Steelers are actually building to actually do that. They actually have the guys. They put investments in to actually do that. Najee Harris will truck pretty much any guy out there, and he'll run people over, right? So if the Raiders want to be a bully and they actually want to do it, they got to actually go out and draft those guys. Right, when I watch Darnell Washington, when I watch Isaac Samalo, I watch guys like Najee Harris put his shoulder down, and I watch guys like Dan Moore Jr. These guys are playing physical, right? They're actually legit, right? And I think for the Raiders, you got to draft some guys. You got to build towards that, and I think there's some pieces there, but you got to figure out what you have this year. And I hope the Raiders do make that change where they keep Jackson Powers-Johnson in there for at least 2 to 3 games. Let's see what this guy can do over, 1 to 2 full games. Let me know what you guys think, man. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, consider subscribing, and I will see you guys next time with another video.